Proverbs chapter 17, beginning in verse 15. This is the word of the living God. It is inspired, inerrant, and infallible. And so let us give our attention to its reading. He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous are both alike an abomination to the Lord. Why should a fool have money in his hand to buy wisdom when he has no sense? A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. One who lacks sense gives a pledge and puts up security in the presence of his neighbor. Whoever loves transgression loves strife. He who makes his door high seeks destruction. A man of crooked heart does not discover good, and one with a dishonest tongue falls into calamity. He who sires a fool gets himself sorrow, and the father of a fool has no joy. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. The wicked accepts a bribe in secret to pervert the ways of justice. The discerning sets his face toward wisdom, but the eyes of a fool are on the ends of the earth. A foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her who bore him. To impose a fine on a righteous man is not good, nor to strike the noble for their uprightness. Whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. Grass grows, and the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Brothers and sisters, we continue in our study together of this book of Proverbs, written by Solomon so long ago, written with ongoing instructions for his son, and by the inspiration and preservation of God's Spirit, written for us as well. It's our desire, as we come to the Proverbs each week, to grow in our wisdom, to grow in our understanding, to see how it is that these words are to be applied and worked out within our lives. To understand the way that we are called to walk in wisdom, a kind of wisdom that bears the kind of fruit that we've been talking about each Sunday morning, the fruit of the Spirit. Well, last week we looked at the first half of this chapter. We were reminded that wisdom is not something disconnected from real life. The way they often show the wise man as an ascetic on the top of a mountain somewhere, having escaped the humdrum of life, so he can give out sage advice to those who crawl their way to the top, is wrong. You see, God's wisdom is for the trenches of life, for real relationships. And we do well to hear and to heed what Solomon teaches us in these verses. Last week we looked at verse 3 of Proverbs 17. Solomon said, "The crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, and the Lord tests hearts." We're reminded, of course, of the way in which God continues to grow wisdom in our lives is often through the challenges that we face. When we combine these truths with some things that we've already seen, the book of Proverbs gives us a vision for two paths: the way of wisdom and the way of folly. Wisdom builds. It builds homes. It builds relationships, reputations, peace, and justice. But folly destroys. It tears down. It tears down trust. It corrodes character and ruins lives. In these verses, we see the contrast played out in various ways in the courtroom when it comes to justice, in the household, in the heart, with the mouth. These verses call us to examine whether our lives are being shaped by the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom, or by the pride and impulsiveness of folly. Each proverb, if you will, functions like a window into our soul, revealing whether we are building with gold or with straw. As the Apostle Paul teaches us that if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. Paul reminds us that every life is built on some foundation. And what we build with, whether gold or straw, will be tested. Only that which is built on wisdom, built on Christ, is durable. For it is built on God's work and by his Spirit, and it will, in fact, last. Jesus offers the same contrast in Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. He says, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. These passages all affirm that the difference between wisdom and folly is not merely intellectual. It is covenantal. It is spiritual. It is relational. Wisdom builds because it listens to God. Folly falls because it refuses him. This contrast, then, in this chapter that I want us to consider is the fruit of wise and foolish choices. How one walks in wisdom leads to stability and life. To walk in folly leads to strife and ruin. If we think in terms of building and destroying, it becomes clear. For building takes intentionality. It requires time, tools, and materials. In life, wisdom builds families, friendships, reputations, and communities slowly and deliberately. Patience and planning are essential. But destruction, folly, it's reckless. It also takes time, though less time. But the tools of destruction, anger, pride, careless words are crude and often used without foresight. It's easier to wreck trust than it is to form it. It's easier to tear down peace than it is to create it. The results differ. What is wisely built tends to endure storms, Jesus says. What is destroyed often collapses quickly and leaves scars. Proverbs shows us that wisdom establishes righteousness while folly unravels relationships and stability. And so this is our goal tonight, and indeed each time we encounter the Proverbs. To be humbled, for we need God's wisdom to build. For building with wisdom shows a heart that is shaped by humility, discipline, and reverence for God. Destroying by folly reveals selfishness, impulsiveness, or disregard for others. In real life, we see this every day. It takes years to build a marriage, but moments to wound it. A lifetime to build a good name, but one lie to destroy it. Steady labor to construct a home, but only neglect or recklessness to ruin it. So Solomon's desire, and indeed our God's desire, is that we would learn wisdom. Wisdom builds, folly destroys. Let's begin to examine our text tonight to see how this unfolds before us in these three brief points. First, note how it is that wisdom promotes righteousness, or we can say righteous rule. The idea here in these verses of 15, 16, 18, and verses 23 to 26 is that true wisdom reflects the moral righteousness of God and resists injustice. It resists rashness, and it resists moral corruption. The first thing to note in verses 15 and 26 before us tonight is that justice is sacred. Verse 15, he who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous are both alike an abomination before or to the Lord. Verse 26, to impose a fine on a righteous man is not good, nor to strike a noble for their uprightness. In both of these verses we see the way that justice is inverted. Perverting justice is a grave offense against both God's nature as well as his delegated authority. Of course, it's a perverted offense against God's nature. God is truth. He is the God who is perfectly just. But it's also against God's delegated authority. Remember what Paul tells us in Romans 13 and verse 4, that the magistrate is God's servant for your good. And indeed, this is the basis of what Peter instructs us in 1 Peter chapter 2 in our responsive reading, where he speaks there of being subject to those masters and honoring the emperor. Looking at our proverb then, to acquit the guilty or condemn the innocent is to usurp and abuse the authority of God. This judicial perversion is detestable, an abomination, and it draws divine wrath. Now, yes, it is true, of course, that paradoxically, the gospel shows God justifying the guilty because of a perfect righteousness, Christ crucified. We want to be cautious with that. It is true that for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21. But it is precisely because at the cross, God's perfect justice and his mercy meet, that we find our salvation. The cross is not God's winking at sin. He is not overlooking it. It is not as though Christ's death is anything less than the perfect atonement for our sin. And we want to understand that. For we see the cross and we understand, even at the same time, that what Solomon says is right. And indeed, we can even see the cross as an example of it. To condemn the righteous is in fact an abomination to the Lord. And so Solomon draws our attention to this matter of justice because it is in fact one of those foundational realities within our relationships. But then he presses further. He speaks of faithfulness with the things that God has given to us. Not merely justice, but in verses 16, 18, and 23 to 24, we see further wisdom with what God has given. Why should a fool have money in his hand to buy wisdom when he has no sense? Verse 16. Verse 18, one who lacks sense gives a pledge and puts up security in the presence of his neighbor. The point here is that fools mishandle money, often using it to entangle others or even to twist justice. Verse 23, the wicked accepts a bribe and in secret to pervert the ways of justice. Verse 24 speaks of their wandering eyes on the ends of the earth, reflect a kind of inner instability, a greed that lacks discernment. Many can affirm how financial foolishness easily becomes a root of conflict, either in relationship or within oneself. The Apostle Paul teaches us in 1 Timothy that if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. There's a call, of course, to be wise with what God has given to us. And yet, there's also a call to remember that what God has given to us in our resources is not the be-all, end-all in our lives. Again, the Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 to 10, he says, now there is great gain in godliness with contentment, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving, he says, that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Solomon calls us then to wisdom with these resources that God has given to us. To be discerning and to set our face toward wisdom in regard to these resources. To use them well, which he goes on to talk about how they are misused. And again, we're still in this idea of righteous rule and justice. Solomon turns to perhaps one of the greatest ways in which money was misused when it comes to injustice, and it was in the case of bribes. Verse 23, Solomon says, the wicked accepts a bribe in secret to pervert the ways of justice. Bribery perverts both private integrity and public trust. Even the world knows to hide it in shame. But God sees and judges in perfect righteousness. What's remarkable, of course, is even though we live in a world that is full of wickedness, the truth is that even our unbelieving neighbors know that this is true. They understand that bribes pervert justice. And remember our understanding of Proverbs about the creation of the world, the covenant with God and Christ. Well, this is creational. Unbelievers, as I said, understand what injustice is, and they don't get it right all the time, as Isaiah decries in Isaiah 5:20, when he says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And yet it is clear that there are understandings of justice, of right and wrong. And Solomon acknowledges the reality of injustice in this world. But this is the point, that as God is righteous, so must we be righteous in all our dealings. For the gospel shapes not only our standing before God, but our integrity before others. We are called as those who have been renewed to walk in that renewed way. That is that covenant that Solomon speaks of here when it comes to wisdom. Now it is true, of course, that there is injustice in this world. It is true that Christians face injustice. We read of such a thing in 1 Peter 2, 18 to 21. In fact, Peter says, for this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. And yet, God's wisdom, and here in Solomon's words, is not calling for us to be doormats for injustice. We are called to seek justice. And some would ask, or point to the tension, well, if we're supposed to seek justice, but Peter says that God may call us to suffer injustice. How do we choose between those options? And the simple answer is we don't. We pursue justice for ourselves. We pursue justice for others. And we also know that when we suffer injustice, that God tells us we identify with Christ. Paul is a wonderful example in this regard. He did not simply submit to all of the abuse that he faced, but rather appealed to Rome. Even though knowing his appeal to Rome would end in his death. Paul was not satisfied to simply let go and let God. Nor was he interested in raising up a revolution and trying to overtake Rome. He sought justice as he could, using the wisdom of God that he had, and he suffered injustice, filling up the sufferings of Christ, he says. Now I understand that can seem paradoxical to us, and so I encourage you to continue to wrestle with that reality, but I think it is in fact the reality that we are called to walk in wisdom and to seek justice. We are not to be satisfied with injustice, but when we face it, we also acknowledge that this is God's call for us to suffer well. We see not only that wisdom promotes righteous rule, but wisdom preserves loving relationships. Here we can say that wisdom builds these covenant relationships within the home. That through humility and love, wisdom transforms our relationships with one another. And Solomon begins with this talk of friendship. Verse 17, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. True friendship, unlike sentimental notions, is selfless and sacrificial, rooted in divine grace. So what do we make of Solomon's words here? A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. I like that the ESV has translated the conjunction as and as opposed to a kind of but, as though it is putting the two statements against each other. They are parallel statements, first about a friend and the second about a brother. And at first glance, the verse might seem to contrast the roles. But grammatically and contextually, it likely combines and complements them. The friend is defined by constant enduring love. He loves at all times, including during adversity. The brother is said to be born for adversity, which implies this providential purpose. God has ordained the brother's role to be the most evident or necessary in hardship. For the brother's support, Solomon says, becomes manifest or essential when trouble arises. Rather than contrasting the two, saying, for instance, that the friend is better than a brother, it is likely presenting the two as kinds of relational faithfulness. The friend represents voluntary, chosen love. The brother represents providential, obligated love. Both are valuable, but together they reflect the covenantal and communal ideas of loyalty, love, and support, especially in adversity. Indeed, we know this is true because Christ himself is the friend and brother who is born for adversity. The author of Hebrews says it this way in Hebrews 2, for he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one origin. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. Indeed, Christ, our elder brother, Christ, our co-heir, Christ, the one who does not call us servants, but who calls us friends in John 15 and verse 15. And indeed, our relationships in this life with friends and brothers is meant to be a reflection of this truth of our walk and our friendship with Christ. But wisdom springs, or just as wisdom is called for, folly springs up. Solomon immediately says in verses 19 and 20, whoever loves transgression loves strife. He who makes his door high seeks destruction. A man of crooked heart does not discover good, and one with dishonest tongue falls into calamity. Pride provokes quarrels. For strife springs from pride, and fools delight in it. The love of quarrels and the high gate, they are signs of pride. A perverse heart leads only to sorrow and division. Indeed, pride must be confronted by us, within us, in our own hearts, first and foremost. For to love strife is to love sin. Solomon presses it further. He brings it home, literally. He speaks of how a foolish child breaks the heart of the godly parent in verses 21 and 25. He says, he who sires a fool gets himself sorrow, and the father of a fool has no joy. A foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him. These proverbs on the grief of ungodly children show the sorrow that sin brings into families, into covenant homes. This is a reminder that parents are not just to instruct, but also to pray fervently. For even as we talked this morning in the baptism of Liliana, about that covenant of grace and the households through which God works. So we see here the importance of it. And I'll simply say that these 2 points go together. And of course, they all go together because they're all proverbs and they all flow together as wisdom is interconnected. Perhaps we can say that one of the things that our children see in us most easily that maybe we cannot is our pride. And so parents must be aware of that. They must be aware of not provoking their children. They must seek to raise their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, because that is wise and that is good. The call then is to build our homes on wisdom. And not just our homes, but our friendships. And to seek after those things that are good and righteous as we seek to be faithful to our God. Thirdly, we see in our text, after wisdom promoting righteous rule and wisdom preserving loving relationships, that wisdom produces a peaceful spirit. A peaceful spirit. Here we would say that wisdom subdues the heart and governs the tongue. For words and attitudes are the fruit of the heart. Wisdom begins by ruling the inner person before speaking or acting. This is what we're called to do. You see, we can simply whitewash the outside, and on the inside we can be full of pride and strife. But that would be to go against what Solomon is saying here. It would further go against what we know God says elsewhere. Indeed, the way in which we are called to walk before our God. For the heart shapes the whole. The heart shapes the whole. Verses 20 and 22, we can look at them. A man of crooked heart does not discover good, and one with a dishonest tongue falls into calamity. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up bones. Solomon begins with his talk of a crooked heart, refers to a morally twisted or perverse inner disposition. Such a person lacks the capacity to recognize or attain what is truly good. That is, that those who are in the flesh cannot please God, Paul says in Romans chapter 8. And it's connected then. This crooked heart is connected with a dishonest tongue. For speech reveals and reinforces the inner corruption. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, Jesus says. And this leads to calamity. This leads to destruction. Sin warps our perception and leads to destruction in our lives. This inner corruption blinds a person to the good and draws him toward ruin. You maybe have known people like this. No matter how they look at things, no matter how they might speak of something, they seem to be drawn toward ruin. What can you do with such a person? Well, if they're a man of crooked heart, if they're a woman of crooked heart, then it reveals what their problem truly is. They need a new heart. For remember that Solomon's ideas here are not simply about cleaning yourself up and walking in outward wisdom. That's why he looks to the heart so often throughout this book. What we need is a heart that is whole, cheerful, and content. We need a new heart. Not a heart of stone, not a heart of sin. This is what we need, for a joyful heart is good medicine. Or as Solomon says elsewhere, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life. Proverbs 4 and verse 23. He calls us to guard our hearts, for the heart is the wellspring of life, like a spring feeding a river. What flows out into our words, choices, and relationships begins within ourselves. To guard the heart, then, means to be careful what we allow to shape our thoughts, our desires, and our affections. We must watch them with vigilance. The call isn't casual, but it is constant. A spring can be polluted little by little. So sin, bitterness, or worldly loves can creep in unnoticed. Vigilance means prayerful self-examination, reliance on God's Spirit to keep our hearts, and trusting ourselves to Him, filling our hearts with His Word, trusting His Spirit to work within us. For we live from that overflow. A guarded heart produces life. For when God's Word dwells richly within us, the overflow is wisdom, kindness, patience and love, the fruit of the Spirit. The life that begins in the heart becomes a blessing to others. But the contrast is clear in our text. A twisted heart, verse 20, bears no good fruit. A joyful heart, verse 22, is life-giving, but a crushed spirit, one not yielded in faith, but mired in self, dries the bones. Together they illustrate that no one can bear good fruit from a corrupted heart. What we need is that new heart that Ezekiel 36 and verse 26 speaks of. Jesus says it this way in Matthew 7, verses 16 to 20. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, you will recognize them by their fruits. The gospel doesn't just mend broken hearts, it recreates them. Jesus heals not only the body, but the heart by forgiving sins. And the joy of the Lord then is our strength. This is what we are called to walk in. This is how we are called to live. And Solomon continues to work it out. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, and the rest of the chapter has to do with words. We know first in verses 27 and 28 how mature words are measured. Whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. We note here, of course, that the wise use of words are oftentimes sparing and calm. Silence is not cowardice, but discipline. Even concealed folly can be considered wisdom, Solomon says. Not every impulse deserves a voice, but rather the tongue must be bridled. This is something that James presses home in chapter 1 as well as in chapter 3. We all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. The fools speak first and regret later. This is, of course, the opposite that we see here in verse 21 or 28. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. But the point, of course, is that fools rarely do that. Silence can make a fool seem wise, but his nature inevitably betrays him. But wisdom grows in the soil of a quiet humility before God. We are called then for our words to heal and not to harm. To not be ruled by our emotions, but to bring them under the lordship of Christ. To govern our speech with wisdom, because Christ governs our hearts. This is the call of wisdom, a wisdom that builds up to avoid the folly that tears down. The call to live with wisdom in the fear of the Lord, as Solomon has continually pressed home in this book. We can say it this way, that these verses of Proverbs 17, 15 to 28 don't simply offer disjointed sayings, but rather a unified portrait of a wise life. In public, it reflects God's justice and moral order. In the home, it nurtures faith, sacrifice, and prayerful love. In the soul, it produces a kind of steadiness and careful speech. Indeed, as David calls out in Psalm 19 and verse 14, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight. All of this is fulfilled in Christ. All of it is to be worked in us by His Spirit, for He is the wisdom of God, our righteous judge, our sacrificial brother, our divine word, the one who changes our hearts by His Spirit. And so let us look to Him to live wisely in this world of confusion and conflict. Indeed, to build up those things that are good, right, holy, and just. Rather, and tearing down through folly.